Right now, somewhere in your mind, a version of tomorrow is already going wrong. The meeting you're dreading. The diagnosis you haven't gotten yet. The conversation you keep rehearsing and avoiding at the same time. You call this worry. You've been taught it's a glitch, something to shut off before it spreads. But 2,000 years ago, a group of philosophers did the exact opposite. Every single morning on purpose, they sat down and imagined the worst thing that could happen to them that day. And they weren't more anxious for it. They were calmer. That should sound backwards. Everything you've heard about anxiety says imagining disaster makes it worse. So why did some of history's most disciplined minds build an entire daily ritual around doing exactly that? Let's start with the man who wrote the instructions down. Seneca, a Roman statesman and philosopher, spent his final years writing letters to his friend Lucilius on how to actually live. In one of them, letter 91, he lays out a technique that would later get a name, premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. His argument was blunt. Nothing, he wrote, should ever catch you off guard, not because you can predict the future. Because you rehearse it first on your own terms before life forces the rehearsal on you. Here's what that looked like in practice. Before a voyage, Seneca imagined the ship going down. Before a meeting with a rival, he imagined losing the argument in front of a room. Before enjoying wealth, he deliberately imagined losing it, not to torture himself, to drain the shock out of it in advance. If the bad thing never happened, he'd spent a few minutes in mild discomfort for nothing. If it did happen, he'd already survived it once quietly in his own head with no real stakes attached. And Seneca didn't stop at imagination. In another letter, letter 18, he describes setting aside a few days at a time to actually live the worst case. Not just picture it. Simple food instead of a rich meal. Rough, cheap clothing instead of fine cloth, a hard floor instead of a soft bed. He'd ask himself in the middle of it, is this really the thing I was so afraid of? The answer, almost every time, was that poverty on paper felt far worse than poverty rehearsed in the body for a weekend. But Seneca wasn't the only one running this drill. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the Roman world, opened his private journal, Meditations, with a version of the same ritual. Every morning he wrote, tell yourself in advance, today I will meet people who are ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous. He wasn't predicting a bad day. He was preloading his reaction to one. By the time the difficult person actually showed up at the palace, Marcus had already met them in rehearsal hours earlier, and the sting was already gone. And Marcus had far more to rehearse than most. Large stretches of his reign were spent fighting wars on the northern frontier, while a plague swept through the empire, killing an unknown but staggering share of the population, possibly including members of his own household. A man facing that scale of daily uncertainty didn't have the luxury of being ambushed by bad news. Premeditation wasn't a self-help exercise for him. It was closer to a survival requirement, scaled up from one difficult colleague to an empire in crisis. So is this just pessimism with better branding? A clever excuse to expect the worst from people? Not quite, and this is where it gets stranger. Epictetus, a philosopher who had spent years enslaved before earning his freedom, added a second layer to the practice. He called it the reserve clause. Whenever you set out to do something, he taught, silently attach a condition to it. I will do this if nothing prevents me. You plan the trip, but you accept the storm might cancel it. You prepare the argument, but you accept you might still lose it. The goal wasn't to expect failure at every turn. It was to stop confusing what you control with what you never did. Rehearsing the bad outcome wasn't fear. It was a way of loosening your grip on results you were never actually holding in the first place. For centuries, this stayed a philosophical curiosity. 3 dead Romans with an unusual mourning habit filed away in old texts. Then, in the 1980s, a psychologist decided to test whether they'd stumbled onto something real. Julie Norham, a researcher at Wellesley College, spent years studying a group of people she came to call defensive pessimists. Before a stressful event, an exam, a presentation, a first date, these people would sit down and vividly imagine everything that could go wrong. Not once in passing, in specific, uncomfortable detail, then walk through exactly how they'd handle each version of failure if it actually happened. And here's the part that surprised almost everyone who studied them. On performance, they matched the confident optimists in the room. Sometimes they beat them, and their measured anxiety going into the event was lower than the group that had simply tried to stay positive and avoid thinking about failure at all. Then Norham ran the experiment that mattered most. She took her group of defensive pessimists and right before their task, stopped half of them from running their usual mental rehearsal. She had them think positive instead, the way self-help culture insists you should. Their performance collapsed. The very habit that looked like anxiety from the outside had been doing real work on the inside the whole time. Take it away, and the anxiety it had been quietly managing came flooding back in, unfiltered, with nowhere left to go. So the imagined disaster was never the problem. It was the pressure valve. This lines up with something modern anxiety treatment has quietly relied on for decades. A core technique in cognitive behavioral therapy is called decatastrophizing, walking a person through their worst-case scenario in vivid, specific detail until it stops feeling unpredictable. Therapists sometimes call the broader version imaginal exposure. Researchers studying anxiety treatment have found that repeatedly and deliberately confronting a feared outcome in your mind in a low-stakes setting measurably lowers the body's physical threat response to it over time. Your nervous system doesn't fully distinguish between a vividly rehearsed scenario and a lived one. Rehearse it enough on your own schedule, and it slowly loses its ability to ambush you. Worry itself isn't rare or unusual. Some form of anticipatory. What if thinking shows up in almost everyone's daily life, whether or not it's ever named or examined? What separates a spiral from a Stoic rehearsal isn't the presence of the thought, it's the structure around it. Which means the Stoics weren't managing fear by avoiding it. They were managing fear by scheduling it. Every morning on their terms for 10 minutes instead of at 2 a.m., on fear's terms for hours. Here's the part that should actually change how you think about your own worry. The anxious spiral you've been taught to suppress, the late-night what-ifs, the imagined version of a hard conversation playing on a loop isn't automatically the enemy you've assumed it is. Left uncontrolled with no structure and no end point, it wears you down and keeps you up. But given a fixed window on purpose with intention behind it, that exact same instinct becomes a rehearsal instead of a spiral. The difference was never the thought itself. It was always whether you were the one scheduling it or it was scheduling you. You don't need a Roman toga or a private journal to run this. Pick one thing you're dreading. Give it a real, fixed window, not an open-ended spiral. Walk through the actual worst case in specific detail. What would happen, what you'd do next, how you'd still be standing afterward. Then, like Seneca stepping back into his fine clothes after a weekend on the floor, close it and step back into your day. The rehearsal has an ending. The spiral never did. So tonight, when your mind starts running through everything that could go wrong tomorrow, you don't have to fight it off. Seneca wouldn't have. Marcus Aurelius wouldn't have. Give it its 10 minutes. Walk through the worst case on purpose in detail until it runs out of new ways to surprise you. Then close the folder and let it go. Not because you've solved tomorrow, because somewhere in your mind you've already met it once quietly on your own terms with no real stakes attached.